They tell you war is chaos, but chaos is something I learned to manage. Real war begins when you realize the enemy isn't seeking victory in the conventional sense. They simply drown you in such a volume of steel that you become a mathematical aberration waiting to be erased. I could feel that volume in every ragged breath I took. The Eastern Front smelled of crude oil and blood. Normandy smells of the ocean, and that is far worse. The ocean has ceased to be our ally. It has become an open, bottomless road leading directly to our throats. We sit here, encased in concrete, like insects trapped in amber. We wait, and we know that what is coming will be stopped by neither a wall nor our will. Only by the depletion of ammunition, theirs or ours. And I know precisely whose reserves will run dry first. WN-60 Observation Post, Omaha Sector. 2340, June 5, 1944. The concrete tasted of stale dampness, a mixture of limestone dust and years of accumulated moisture. Outside, the rain was not heavy, but persistent, the kind of fine drizzle that permeates everything, making the air thick and the silence unnatural. I hadn't slept properly in 48 hours, not since the last U-boat reconnaissance report confirmed the immense buildup in Portsmouth. I stood over the map table in the low-ceilinged bunker, the single electric lamp casting sharp shadows on the meticulously drawn contour lines of the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. My sector, WN-60, covered the western flank of what the Americans would later christen Omaha. A death trap built of reinforced concrete and wishful thinking. Major Muller, my lead radio operator, mumbled, his face pale and drawn under the headset. He was barely 20, fresh from Hamburg, and terrified of the sea. The jamming is heavy, sir. Very heavy. And the code groups, they are changing protocols every 20 minutes. It's not the usual static. It's organized. I ran a finger along the coastal defenses marked in red pencil. They are testing us, Muller. Looking for weaknesses. Or they are covering something. I lit a thin, dry cigarette, the last of my French ration. The smoke tasted bitter. I had spent 8 years calculating trajectories and analyzing fire correction. My specialty was eliminating variables. But the variables here were multiplying exponentially. What about the divisional headquarters? I asked, leaning closer to the radio set. The machine, a reliable German-made Tornister-Empfänger, crackled spitefully. They report increased air activity over the Cotentin Peninsula. Paratroopers, they think. But general high alert has not been issued. They still believe it's a localized raid or a diversion, sir. Diversion. The word was an insult to my intelligence. I remembered the scale of the offensives on the Foucault front. Hundreds of thousands of men hurled into the grinder for minimal gain. The Allied operation had been planned for months, perhaps years. To commit the vast resources of the U.S. and British fleets merely for a localized raid defied all military logic. I walked to the steel embrasure, peering out into the abyssal blackness of the channel. The visibility was perhaps 50 meters, obscured by mist and rain. The sea ought to have been loud, a continuous roar of waves. Tonight, it was muffled, almost courteous. The air traffic is low altitude, Muller? Yes, sir. Very low. Sounds like the heavy transports. They're avoiding our radar net. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The air traffic wasn't what concerned me. It was the lack of surface sound. Where were the patrol boats? Where were the submarines, the German Navy? They were either sunk, bottled up, or operating too far west to matter. The enemy owned the sea. That single, terrifying realization was the core of my professional analysis. We were observers in a glass cage, watching the executioner approach across his own, well-lit stage. I stubbed out the cigarette on the concrete floor. Alert battery, R403. Tell Captain Gruber to double-check their firing data for the 105s. If they hear so much as a rowing boat engine, they are to acquire and hold target lock. No firing without my direct order, but they must be ready to unleash hell instantly. Muller nodded, adjusting his headset. His hands trembled slightly as he keyed the microphone. The atmosphere was not one of heightened vigilance, but of frozen dread. We were the guardians of a static line, waiting for a dynamic force to crash against it. 1:30, June 6, 1944. The night shattered not with a crash, but with a tearing sound, like heavy canvas ripping right across the low clouds. It was the sustained, Deep growl of hundreds of heavy aircraft engines, far lower than they ought to be, descending rapidly towards the French mainland behind us. I scrambled out of the bunker and onto the exposed roof position, the cold rain instantly soaking my field gray tunic. The searchlights were useless in the thick mist, but momentarily, as the cloud cover shifted, I saw them. They were enormous, dark, ghostly shapes. C-47 transport planes, hundreds of them, flying in tight formation. And trailing them, silently, terrifyingly, were the gliders. Massive Horsa and Waco gliders, sliding down through the damp air like predatory owls, heading straight for the inland river valleys and bridges. Paratroopers. They're landing behind us, shouted Lieutenant Schultz, the infantry liaison, scrambling to the nearest MG nest. The night erupted in sporadic, panicked machine gun fire from our rear trenches, the tracers reaching up fruitlessly into the mist. It was disorganized, scattered. I grabbed the field telephone receiver from the concrete shelf, my fingers slick with rain. I needed to know the scale. I needed confirmation. WN-60 to division. Report. What is the assessment of the air assault? The line crackled violently. A frustrated, tinny voice, belonging to a junior staff officer in the command bunker 10 kilometers away, answered, Major Voss? Stay calm. It is confirmed. Air landing operation near Saint-Mire-Église. Localized. General Command believes this is the standard diversionary tactic for the real invasion, which will be in the Pas de Calais. Do not panic. Localize the threat. Do not expose your artillery batteries prematurely. I slammed the receiver back onto the hook, the metallic clang lost in the growing roar of the engines. Localized? They were dropping thousands of men. They were seizing vital crossroads and bridges, slicing the arteries of our internal defense system before the operation had even formally begun. I turned to Schultz, my voice low and urgent. This is not a diversion. The scale is too great. This is the initiation. Their goal is to paralyze our reserves and block all counterattacks. I looked back out to the sea. In the brief pause between the waves of aircraft, I felt it. A deep, profound vibration traveling through the bedrock. It wasn't the sound of engines. It was the vast, distant drumming of colossal objects impacting the water. The warships were moving into position. Muller, try our 403 again. Tell Gruber they have full authorization to fire on any identified enemy transport, regardless of size. The Atlantic Wall is no longer a concrete structure. It is a desperate line of men. And that line starts now. The radio remained choked with static. Then, briefly, Muller received a fragment of a transmission from Gruber's battery. Enemy contact. Fire. Counter battery. Impossible to see we are. The transmission was replaced by a high-pitched, whining shriek of dead air. I stared at Muller. He didn't need to say it. Their communications were gone, which meant they were either destroyed or had been forced to abandon their post under heavy fire. The main event was approaching, heralded not by a battle cry, but by utter logistical superiority. 5:35, June 6, 1944. Dawn arrived not as a gentle transition of light, but as a violent explosion of color and sound. I was huddled inside the main post, attempting to repair a secondary telephone line to an infantry support trench when the world ceased to be a recognizable place. The naval bombardment began. It was not sporadic shelling. It was a continuous, bone-shaking thunder. The sound wasn't a series of bangs. It was one monolithic, unbearable roar that seemed to be actively tearing the air apart. I covered my ears, but the sound traveled through the concrete, through my boots, through my bones. My teeth rattled. Loose equipment bounced on the floor. Dust and pulverized rock rained down from the ceiling. I stumbled back to the embrasure, pushing the heavy observation shield aside. What I saw defied belief. The horizon was an unbroken line of fire. Orange, white, and red flashes erupted from the mouths of hundreds of ships, a solid curtain of muzzle blasts. The shells descended upon the beach and the defenses with insane frequency. I watched a 50-meter section of the beach defense vanish in a plume of smoke and debris. Then another, and another. I was an artillery officer. I understood calibers. I could identify the heavy thump of 14-inch guns and the rapid crunch of 8-inch cruisers. They were using everything they had, and they were using it with an inhuman, industrialized precision. I managed to grab the microphone connected to the command network, though I knew it was futile. I screamed my observation into the static. WN-60 to all remaining batteries. Priority target saturation. Fire on bearing 34, Henry 17. Suppress naval fire. They are destroying the seawall. Engage immediately. The only response was the deep, guttural sound of the incoming shells, the constant whoosh that ended in an earth-shattering detonation. A runner, Private Schmidt, his face covered in concrete dust and blood, crawled into the bunker. Major, our 403 is gone. A direct hit on the ammunition dump. The battery is finished. We have 3 working guns in the sector, sir. 2 75mm PaK-40s and a single MG-42 nest that hasn't been buried yet. 3 working guns. Against the combined firepower of the Royal Navy and the U.S. fleet. I looked back out at the coast, seeing where my precious, numerically inferior 105mm howitzers were supposed to have been. Now, that position was nothing but a smoking crater, a wound in the earth that still pulsed with heat. The Atlantic Wall, the great fortress propaganda had promised, was a shallow, pathetic lie. It was designed to withstand coastal raids and minor shelling, not this overwhelming, calculated deluge. They had breached the wall before the infantry had even stepped foot on the sand. The bombing intensified for another full hour. The world shrank to the size of the bunker. I lay flat on my stomach, clutching my binoculars, waiting for the concussions to stop, knowing that once they did, the real battle would begin. The battle of flesh and blood against their unstoppable machine. 6:15. The naval fire lifted slightly, shifting its focus inland to interdict the prepositioned lines of advance. The silence was relative, but the sudden drop in decibels was jarring. My ears rang savagely. I knew I could not remain in the main bunker. It was a targeted position, and they would be sending infantry to clear it soon. I grabbed my map case, my personal P-38 pistol, and instructed the remaining 3 men, Schultz, Schmidt, and a shell-shocked engineer, to follow me. We crawled out of the shattered post and traversed the short, exposed stretch to a subsidiary observation slit built into a rocky outcrop. The view from there was terrifyingly clear. I reached the outcrop, pushed myself up, and brought the binoculars to my eyes. My hands were shaking, but the professional I immediately imposed order on the chaos. I dropped the binoculars, my mouth dry. I had seen vast fleets before, troop transports crossing the Baltic in 41. But this. The ocean horizon was no longer blue or gray. It was solid metal. The ships stretched in every direction, an endless expanse of hulls and superstructures. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships. I recognized the distinctive tripod masts of the British King George V class, and the bulky, imposing silhouette of an American heavy cruiser, likely the Augusta. And between them, thousands of landing craft. LCI, LST, LCT. They were arrayed in perfect, disciplined lines, moving towards the beach with the inexorable, unhurried certainty of a factory conveyor belt. We are fighting blueprints and timetables. I thought, the cold analysis overriding the fear. They are not attacking, they are arriving. This was not a military assault. It was a logistical operation deployed across the entire visible surface of the sea. A monstrous realization hit me. I saw a single battleship fire a full broadside. The volume of steel fired in that 1 minute was more tonnage than my entire sector, including all my destroyed guns, had fired in the last 6 months of training. We are simply foam on the beach, waiting to be washed away. My duty, however, was simple. Find a functioning artillery unit, any unit, and give them targeting data. My sector was lost, but the road network to Bayeux had to be held. Schultz, I rasped, pointing inland. The supply roads. If they secure the high ground and the D8, the entire 352nd Infantry is cut off. We need to reach the regimental rear post. Is the field phone still functional? Schultz checked the frayed wires. Dead, Major. Completely dead. The barrage took everything down. Then we walk. And we find a radio operator who still has a working battery. We began moving, crouching low, parallel to the smoking beach. 7 o'clock. We moved cautiously along the top of the dune line, affording us a terrible, panoramic view of the beach itself. The tide was coming in. The air was a heavy, nauseating blend of smells. Cordite, The acrid scent of burning diesel, wet, churned sand, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. The sand, which had been fine and gray, was now compacted into a greasy, bloody paste dotted with twisted metal and debris. The first waves had hit. The Americans were pinned down, as we had planned. The obstacles, the mines, the MG-42 fire from the few surviving emplacements. It was working. The beach was a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of olive-drab bodies were washing back and forth in the surf. But they kept coming. I watched a landing craft, an LCT, open its ramp. Instead of hesitating, the men inside sprinted forward. One fell immediately, struck by a bullet from WN-62 to the west. But the 20 men behind him didn't falter. They didn't stop to help. They ran over him. They knew the rules of the mathematics. Individual loss must never impede the movement of the mass. We encountered Oberleutnant Kruger, the commander of the Forward Infantry Company, near a shattered anti-tank ditch. He was leaning against a block of broken concrete, clutching a bandaged shoulder, his face the color of wet chalk. Major Voss, thank God, we're being overwhelmed. Kruger's voice was hoarse. We killed the first wave. We killed the second. But they replace every man instantly. They don't look for cover, Major. They just advance. It's unnatural. Anti-tank guns. I demanded. Where are the PaK-40s? Gone. All gone. Naval fire, 5-inch shells, continuous. They shelled us until the concrete turned to dust. And the tanks, Major. They're bringing tanks right onto the beach. I raised my binoculars again, focusing on the chaos below. The floating DD Shermans, struggling in the surf. And then the bulldozers. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were engineering. Massive armored bulldozers were pushing debris aside, clearing lanes through the carefully laid obstacles and mines. They were building a road inland, right there on the beach, under fire. First moment of revelation. I watched as one of our remaining 75mm anti-tank rounds hit the side of a Sherman. The tank shuddered, the armor absorbing the impact. It slowed, but kept moving. A second round struck the same spot. A loud clang, a spark. The tank merely corrected its course and kept advancing. Only the third round, hitting the turret ring, ignited the fuel. Our weapons are obsolete, I realized with chilling clarity. Or, more accurately, they were too few and too weak to stop the relentless stream of new, heavy equipment arriving every minute. For every Sherman we stopped, 2 more were already being disgorged from the landing craft that were beaching with terrifying regularity. This was not a battle of tactics. It was an audit of industrial capacity. 10 o'clock. The small group, myself, Schultz, Schmidt, and the engineer, pushed inland, seeking any functioning link to the division. The roads were already choked, not with enemy traffic, but with the wreckage of our own countermeasures. Abandoned trucks, craters big enough to swallow a house. And the air, though temporarily free of mass bombardment, was dominated by Allied fighter bombers. They flew low and slow, unchallenged, taking their time selecting targets. Every intersection, every concentration of German troops, was immediately greeted by rockets and cannon fire. Where are our planes? The question was rhetorical. The Luftwaffe was a phantom force, drained dry over the Eastern Front, defending Berlin, or simply outmatched by the Allied air industry. I ran past a ditch where a soldier was desperately trying to reload a 20mm flak cannon, futilely firing bursts at AP-47 Thunderbolt, making a slow, lazy pass. The plane simply laughed in the form of a long burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire, shredding the flak gun and the operator. My mind, trained in cold military calculation, began its dreadful work. I recalled the intelligence reports from the East, the staggering production rates of the Soviet T-34. Now, the West was mirroring that output. Propaganda told us the Allies were soft, decadent, and incapable of sacrifice. But I saw the sacrifice being made and immediately replaced. For every T-4 tank we built, the Russians built 3 T-34s. Here, for every Panzer they destroy, 2 more Shermans are already standing on the sand, ready to roll. The Allies have brought enough resources to fight the war for another year, just on this beachhead. I found a makeshift command post in a derelict farm shed, where Captain Schneider, a communications officer, was screaming into a field telephone receiver. No, not a diversion. I see them. Thousands. Where are the reserves? Where is the 12th SS Panzer Division? Where is Rommel? Schneider hurled the phone across the room. It shattered against the stone wall. His eyes were wide and vacant. They're stuck, he whispered, his voice cracking. Our reserves are stuck. They need authorization. Authorization. While the Americans are unloading an entire division, we need 3 signatures to move a platoon across the river. The paralyzing bureaucracy of the German High Command, the fatal flaw that had plagued us since the beginning, was now ensuring our utter defeat. Rommel was in Germany, trying to petition Hitler for panzer reserves, and no one dared wake the Führer to authorize the move. We must block the road to Bayeux, I said, pointing at the map hanging crookedly on the wall. If they secure that town, our entire flank is open. Schneider slumped against the wall. We have nothing to block it with, Major. We have 3 mortars and 50 men who haven't seen combat. They are advancing past our dead and into the heartland. 1400 hours. I took charge of what little was left. My unit now consisted of 15 men, remnants of Signal Corps, 2 cooks, and 3 wounded infantrymen who could still hold a rifle. We carried 1 working, portable radio set, a miracle, and, crucially, we found a discarded Panzerschreck, a German anti-tank rocket launcher, with 2 rounds tucked neatly inside a destroyed half-track. We moved 3 kilometers inland, finding a small, high-walled Norman farm at the junction of 2 narrow lanes, D514 and D8. If the Americans took this junction, they would bypass the remaining pockets of resistance entirely. My mind was clear, devoid of emotion. It was pure arithmetic now. Objective: delay the armored advance for 1 critical hour. Resources: 1 Panzerschreck, 15 men, limited ammunition. We fortified the ruins. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant, ceaseless chatter of small arms fire confirmed the enemy was consolidating the beachhead. I positioned myself behind a thick stone wall, the heavy Panzerschreck resting on the crumbling ledge. I was an artillery observer, a professional analyst, not a close-quarters fighter. Yet, this was the final calculation. My professional skills, my years of training, must be applied to the most pressing, immediate threat. I could see the American logistical efficiency even here. They were not using infantry scouts. They were relying on air spotters and their own relentless momentum. They knew we had no air cover, and they acted with complete impunity. We taught the world how to wage war, but we failed to teach them how to lose, because we never learned ourselves. And they, the Americans, learned how to win from us, and then added what we never had: infinite fuel, infinite steel. I looked at the radio set. Muller's replacement, a young private named Heinrich, was hunched over it, desperately trying to tune in the last functioning artillery battery, reported to be 20 kilometers to the east. Anything, Heinrich? Just static, Major. Wait, a signal. Faint, but clear. Battery B, 105 millimeters, still operational. They are asking for targeting coordinates for interdiction fire. The chance was microscopic. The signal was fading rapidly. I had to use this final connection to inflict maximum damage. But where? The crossroads? 1630. They arrived suddenly. Not a probe, but a confident advance. 3 Sherman tanks, preceded by an attached squad of U.S. infantry, emerged from the low, green bocage. They were moving quickly, trying to bypass the heavy fighting still raging closer to the beach. I settled the sight of the Panzerschreck. The range was 80 meters, far too close for comfort, but ideal for the primitive launcher. Calculation: aim for the transmission housing, low front plate. I fired the first round. A catastrophic miss. The rocket clipped a branch and detonated harmlessly in the dirt. The tanks paused, their crews alerted by the sound. I reloaded the final rocket, my hands slick with sweat and grime. The lead Sherman began turning its turret toward our position. I fired the second round. Perfect. It struck the Sherman precisely where the front plate met the tracks. The impact was deafening. The tank exploded immediately, its internal ammunition cooking off with a fierce hump. The remaining 2 Shermans stopped dead. The American infantry hit the dirt, stunned by the sudden loss of their lead armor. The second Sherman, realizing the threat, swung its massive 75 millimeters main gun toward the ruins of our farm. I threw myself flat as the first round impacted the stone wall just above my head. Shrapnel and rock shards flew everywhere. I crawled back toward Heinrich and the radio set. The shell had thrown the small set onto its side, but the transmitter light was still weakly glowing. Heinrich, give me the microphone. I grabbed the handset. The signal was still there, faint but present. Battery B. Battery B, this is Major Voss, WN60. Urgent fire mission. Coordinates for immediate strike. Sector 35, Caesar, 22. Fire 4 rounds, immediate. Heinrich, who had managed to unpin himself from the rubble, stared at me, his eyes wide with incomprehension. Major, wait. Those coordinates. 35, Caesar, 22. That is this position. That is the farm. The 3rd Sherman, meanwhile, had begun its slow, deliberate advance toward our position, preparing to blast the ruin with coaxial machine gun fire. The accompanying American infantry was beginning to flank us, using the hedges for cover. I pushed Heinrich aside and keyed the transmission button again, my voice rough but controlled, repeating the data. Affirmative, 35, Caesar, 22. Fire on target. Fire on us. Do it now? If they pass this point, we lose the line. Execute. I dropped the microphone. It didn't matter if they survived the transmission. My part of the war was over. I grabbed my P-38 and shouted to the few remaining men. Final defense. Target the infantry. We hold the line until the last moment. The Americans opened fire with their rifles and MGs, peppering the ruins. The 3rd Sherman lumbered closer, a dark, heavy specter of inevitable death. Then, the sound. It was not the sound of incoming enemy fire. It was the sound that only an artillery man recognizes, the high, ripping whistle of the incoming shell from a German 105mm howitzer. It was the swift, precise judgment of our own battery, confirming that the shells were already on their terminal trajectory, obediently traveling exactly where I had ordered them to go. The first shell landed 50 meters short, a blinding flash that tore through the leading American infantry squad. The 2nd and 3rd rounds followed almost instantly. A direct hit on the 3rd Sherman, which erupted in a towering column of fire, its tracks still grinding futilely. The 4th round, the final, brutal act of professional duty, impacted the stone structure of the farm itself, exactly where I had been standing. I felt a monumental shove, a punch delivered by the entire weight of the continent. Everything went white, then black. The world flipped and crashed around me. I felt a searing, sharp pain in my left arm, a dull crushing weight on my chest. When the ringing silence finally subsided, I could see Heinrich, pinned under a beam, his chest cavity crushed. He was dead, his hands still clutching the fallen radio handset. The rest of the farm was gone. I pushed myself up, shards of wood and stone embedded in my tunic. The explosion had scoured the junction clean. The 2nd Sherman had begun to reverse and retreat into the cover of the bocage. The surviving American infantry was scattering, confused and broken by the sudden, unexpected, and devastating friendly fire. We had achieved our objective. We had sealed the junction. The cost was absolute. Late sunset, June 6, 1944. I lay in a shallow crater, waiting for the dark. My left arm was definitely broken, the bone screaming with every movement. When I finally stirred, the sky was painted with the ominous orange glow of distant fires, fires that marked the continuing inferno on Omaha Beach. The only sound was the far-off drone of transport planes, already bringing in the 2nd wave of supplies. I stood up, discarding the useless P-38. I left behind not just a small, courageous band of men, but my final belief in the war that could be won by human courage or professional skill alone. I saw them today. They were not driven by Hitler or the Reich. They were driven by Detroit, by the ore mined in Minnesota, by the fuel pumped in Texas, by the assembly lines of Pittsburgh. They brought here not an army, but a factory. I am an artilleryman. I love precise calculations. And here is my final calculation. The enemy produced 10 times more ordnance today than we fired. Their losses, tragic and heavy, are for their system merely a necessary cost of replenishment. Our death, mine, Heinrich's, Kruger's, is an absolute, irreplaceable deficit. When I came here, I spoke of duty, of honor. Now I know that honor is merely the consolation prize for the vanquished. The only truth about the War of 1944 is this. If you cannot manufacture more than your enemy, no concrete wall, no desperate will, no tactical genius will save you. The sea has calmed. It awaits the next tide of steel. I turn my back on the ocean and walk east, deeper inland. Back to the rear, where they will soon try to organize a new front line. But I know it is futile, because the wave of steel I witnessed on that beach today will not stop until it reaches Berlin. We were merely the first obstacle that had to be washed away. And we were washed away.